So in a recent video, I shared with you what my bathroom used to look like and what it looks like now. Well, this is what it looked like in 2017, but I haven't changed anything. But the thing that I pointed out to you is the vanity that I built from scratch. And in this video, I'm going to share with you step by step what I did to turn the vanity from this, which is the original 2010, actually it goes back as far as the 70s, into what it looks like now. And it's been through a series of changes. I've painted it several times, and it wasn't until about 2017 that I had what I think was enough guts to build my own vanity from scratch. And so that's what I'm going to walk you through. But first, I want to go through how to actually dismantle a vanity, because before you bring in the new vanity, whether you're buying it, whether you're building it like this red oak one that I built, you have to dismantle the old one. So let's go through that real quickly. Now, I was lucky because at this time, I didn't feel comfortable doing anything with plumbing. I didn't know anything about removing an old vanity, but Edmundo, who's helping here, had pointed out all the connection spots that have to be disconnected from the plumbing before the old vanity can be removed. And you'll see that screw where the top is being screwed to the base. You'll want to remove that too. And if it's hard to get off, just put a putty knife there and it should start to lift off. Now, you probably have some caulking along that 4-inch backsplash, and so you'll need a putty knife, or you can use anything that's sharp in order to cut that seal, and that should help to lift that top off there completely. Now, when you lift this up, you'll see that there are some connection hoses that are still attached to the sinks, and Edmundo suggested if you're getting a new vanity or if you're getting a new top or a new sink, then just go ahead and get new connection hoses. Now, we did have some plumbing going through the vanity, so we had to cut that out. Also, you'll notice that the vanity, you'll see by the red arrows, is attached to the stud. So use a screwdriver or drill and loosen that, and you'll see here that we are cutting out part of the vanity. And it was just easier for him to do that so that he could remove these pieces separately. And you'll see the original wallpaper, oh my gosh, and probably about 30 years of dust underneath, or I should say behind, that original vanity. All right, so let's talk about building this vanity from scratch. Now, you don't have to follow these directions exactly, because I am using upcycled wood and I'm building a base, but you can get legs just like this. You can order them online and build your vanity, and you don't have to use upcycled legs like I did. But of course, they're beautiful and I wanted to use them. So I stripped them down, cut them to size, and these are the 4 that I was going to build the vanity upon. Now, in order to get I guess you would call these the aprons attached to them, I needed to make pocket holes. And I tried to set it in about 1/4 of an inch so it looked nice. And the Craig jig, you can get one for probably about $100. It's really great for building and being able to connect the wood. You just have to make sure that you get the right screws. These are the ones for hardwood, since I'm using red oak to build this. And this is the part that I use just plywood. And you'll see that I've got pocket holes going all the way around the perimeter. And with a little bit of wood glue, I was able to secure that. And I also added some bracing at each of the 4 corners. And I just used some of the red oak, with a little bit of wood glue and pocket holes, and just wanted to make sure that that frame was reinforced. And I also added another red oak board down the center for extra support and stability. So this is what the base looked like when I was done. The next step was to create these sides. Now, I'm building on top of this platform, and so I wanted to build this panel with 3/4 inch oak, and I used a Craig jig in order to create those pocket holes. And then I took some thinner wood, red oak, and just glued those into the center. My biggest concern was how I was going to get these to stay rigid while building on top. I knew I was going to have to use pocket holes again, but whenever you're doing pocket holes, depending on how you're building things, I was worried that those screws would come out the opposite end. So I just had to be very gentle, maybe even not even putting the pocket screws all the way through to prevent them breaking through the bottom. Well, I did add an extra board. I jerry-rigged so many parts of this, and I just glued that to the base and then used a Simpson strong tie, one of those corner right angle brackets, to make sure it was all put together. Now, if I had used different tools or had different tools at that time, I probably would have used a biscuit joiner. I would have used my domino, which is made by Festool, any of those things in order to attach those panels to the side, but I didn't have those and I just worked with whatever I could do. And I'd never done this before. Now, keep in mind with your vanity, you have to make sure there's enough room for plumbing, which I barely had enough room for plumbing. And then I cut the rails and the stiles as well as that back piece and anchored that to the studs. And those pieces were connected with pocket holes and screws as well. And so once it was all joined together and tightened up and secure to the studs in the wall, it actually was pretty secure. I was very proud of myself. So then it was moving on to the next part. Now, back then, I didn't know how to use SketchUp in order to create a model of what I wanted to build. So I just drafted it out on paper, not realizing that, oh, some parts need to be exact if you want to get a nice exact cut. And if you see those partitions, this is where I ran into problems because the partition wasn't quite long enough. And so I ended up having this gap in the back, and I didn't want to have to go and get all new plywood for these cuts. So what I did was I had some 1/4 inch, you see that part sticking up there, that's a piece of red oak that was about 1/2 inch thick. And I, again, had to kind of jerry rig it where I cut these little pieces in order to stick behind where there was that gap. And then I just used a brad nailer to secure that in place. And so I ended up doing a lot of workarounds in order to get these center partitions in place. But if you're using a program like SketchUp, a lot of times you won't make these mistakes because you will have drafted it out on the computer and you'd have all the measurements. And I am going to tell you in just a moment about putting the sink on top, but I had to cut out part of that partition because I didn't realize the sink was a little too deep. But you'll hear about that in just a moment. Let's move on to the next part. Making the drawers. This was the part that was really fun, but this is where, you really had to be accurate for everything. And this was also important because those drawer slides needed to be positioned just so. And you'll see that I've got this blue Craig supporting thing there clamped to the wood. I needed that because it was just me building this. I didn't have something holding it in place, and this thing comes in handy. The most important thing is making sure that the drawer slides are level, because when you're building drawers, you can't have one that's up a little higher and one that's down a little lower, because as you're trying to slide these drawers in, it's not going to fit. And keep in mind that the width of your drawers has to equal the width between those drawer slides. So when building my drawers, I did a left side, a right side, back, front, and bottom. And you'll see where the red arrows are. Those were the parts that were routed out because that bottom was going to just fit inside of those grooves. And if you don't have a router table, that's fine. You can get a little $60, $70 handheld router from Ryobi. It works fine. And the pocket holes, those are what connects the front piece to the sides. And don't worry about the pocket holes being visible because you will have like a front piece of those drawers that cover that up. And I ended up making 4, had 2 for the left and 2 for the right. And I believe the back, well, everything was glued together and the back was secured with just a brad nailer. But you may be wondering, why did I use pocket holes for the front? Well, that was because you're going to be pulling on that drawer. So you want a little bit more strength in the front. And just to show you, this is what the bottom looks like when you've got that bottom piece glued and fitted snugly in the sides and the back. Now, the next part was to attach the hardware, the drawer slide, to the sides of the drawer. And there was just a lot of like clamping and just using scrap wood to make sure everything was even on all of the boxes. And so it's, I don't know, you just got to kind of figure it out, but don't be afraid to use clamps and scrap pieces of wood to make sure it's even so that when you slide it in, it actually slides and that it's appropriately spaced. I can't tell you how I did the spacing. I just tried to figure out, okay, where do I want these to slide in relation to each other? Is it level? And then going from there. So there's a little bit of time it takes, especially when you've never done this before. But in true thrift diving fashion, I'm going to tell you what went wrong. Now, remember I said the width of your drawers has to be the width between the drawer slides? Well, that's not just for the front. It also is for the back. And guess what? I ran into a problem. Right back there, I could not get one of my drawers in all the way. You know what the problem was? One of my partitions was not in there properly. Like it had kind of scoot over about 1/4 of an inch. So when trying to put the drawer slides in, I'm testing them out, and over on that far left side, one of them would not go in all the way because it was not the same distance. And so as I'm like trying to pull it out and pull it in, it's not really it's not really gliding the way it's supposed to. So I ended up having to take a sander to one of those drawers and sanded like the heck out of it just so I could fit it in there. So yeah, it happened. So that's why making sure you've got even spacing in the front and the back of that cavity where the drawers are is so important. Now see where that arrow is? I did add some extra bracing there where the sinks will be. And the next part was making the cabinet doors. Did I make mistakes? Of course I did. Let's talk about what happened. So this is what I was trying to get to. I had the drawer fronts cut and attached, and I had the doors cut and attached. But getting there was not quite so easy. Now the measurements that I took, the height and the width, I needed panels that were going to be a little wider than what was even available at Home Depot. So if you go to Home Depot, if you get a solid piece of red oak, it's only going to come in a 1x12. Well, I needed something slightly larger. So I took a long piece and cut it in half, and I was going to have to glue this together and make it look seamless. If I were doing this project today, I probably would use a biscuit joiner. I would not necessarily just use wood glue and clamps, but I would use a biscuit joiner or I would use a Festool domino. Instead, what I did was I glued the two boards together, and I found a really cool tip. If you keep some of the sawdust from the wood that you're cutting and add a little bit of wood glue, you can make your own wood filler from the exact same wood that you just cut. So you see here that there is a little bit of a lip, a little bit of a gap between those two boards. I created my own wood filler and then used an orbital sander to try to smooth everything to make it look like one continuous piece. But again, if you have a biscuit joiner or a domino, you can get a really good effect with joining two pieces of wood and making it look seamless. But this is not too bad for just wood glue and using an orbital sander. Now, if you don't have a router table, you can try to do a handheld router. That's fine, but a router table is great for doing projects like this. I wanted a decorative edge on those cabinet doors, and I decided to go with something like this. Now, it looks great in theory, and I'll show you in a moment why it didn't work because I ran into a little bit of a problem. But for this cabinet, I'm going to be using the Vanity. I'm using a concealed hinge. Craig makes this really cool jig that allows you to easily use your drill and drill the hole that you need for the hardware. So I tell people all the time, test, test, test. Don't do it on your real project. Do it on a sample board. I did it on a sample board and it looked good. And I thought, wow, look at that. It fits right in there. And because it looked good, I thought I could move on to my real vanity doors. But as I started drilling and went to pull the drill away, I realized that I cut a hole directly into the decorative edge. You see that black hole there? And when I went to go put the hardware in, you could see a part of the hardware showing on the opposite side where the decorative edge was. And this piece of solid red oak, it was like $50, and there was no way that I was going to go and get a whole new piece. So what did I do? I used my trusty handy little woodworking tip. I made my own wood glue and patched it up and then sanded it smooth, and it was totally fine. So I went ahead and mounted the doors, and for some reason I don't have any footage of the drawer fronts. I don't know why I didn't add those, but basically what I did was I cut those and did the same decorative routed edge all around them, and then glued and screwed them to the cabinet box, each of the cabinet boxes. There were 4 of them. And this is what it looked like when I was done. Now, was it perfect? Definitely not. I'd never made drawer fronts before. I'd never even made a vanity. And I feel like this video is more of like, hey, here's how I jerry-rigged this vanity. But overall, I think it was a pretty solid build for something that I'd never done before. So the next step was to get the granite for the vanity, and there was only one person that I would call to do this. My friend Edmundo from ENC Granite, who's a company that's located here in the Maryland, DC, Virginia area. So he said, come on over, look through the granite, let me know what you like, and I'll help you out, because I know there's a remnant in there that I can spare you. And that's what I found, this beautiful white granite top, and he cut it. Now, I will tell you that whenever you are working with someone to do a vanity top, of course, you pick out your granite, but then you let them know what sinks you're going to use, because they actually have to use the sink template to cut out for the sinks. Now, this is the sink that I'm using. I don't think it's even available at Home Depot anymore, but that's what I'm using. You can get one that's comparable. And while Edmundo was taking care of the granite top, I used some of this steel wool around the plumbing underneath of the vanity. Now, if you remember from my original picture, there were big holes there. So you can find a link down below if you do have big holes that you need to repair. And the reason why you'd want to use the steel wool is because you want to keep out mice, any kind of rodents that would want to come in through the pipes. So while I was taking care of that, Edmundo was putting some sealant around the lip of the sink and then turning those over and mounting those to the granite. And this is why it's important to know what sink you're using before you get your granite installed, because of course that granite has to be cut out and it has to be specific to those sinks that you're using. Now, remember I told you that I had to make some cuts to the partitions? This is the reason why, because when Edmundo came and mounted the sinks to the granite, we couldn't actually fit the sinks because of that, that tall partition. So we had to cut that down. Thankfully, wherever I had that drawer mount, it didn't, it wasn't really impacted. Now, he did drill when he was on site for the new faucet, and I decided to choose this really pretty oil bronzed faucet. I love it. I absolutely love it. And when that was done, it was time to move on to actually correcting the drawers. Now, remember, because of that sink being very low and having to make those modifications, I had to cut the drawers down just a little bit and use an orbital sander to sand them down so that I could slide those drawers in. Again, because I kind of jerry-rigged this entire vanity, I didn't anticipate having to do that. But by the time everything was done, the drawers were fitting very nicely with the sink in place, with the vanity in place, or the vanity top, and I didn't have, anything impacting those drawer slides. So then we could move on to the final step, which was finishing. Now, as much as I love paint and wood stain, I didn't want to do either of those for this vanity. Instead, I chose a wood dye. And the difference is that it's powdered based and you mix it with water and it actually penetrates the wood. This is red oak and it's got those really deep grooves. And I knew that if I did a wood dye with a liming wax, it was going to look beautiful. Now, I can tell you that I did many sample boards before I decided to do this on my actual vanity. I did not want to ruin this. So I did a couple of stain options. I did the one on the left, which was a beautiful ebony, but that was a little too dark. And then I did the one on the right, which is gray, but it looked kind of brown and I liked that. And so I decided, okay, I know enough about what I'm doing now. Let's go. Let's do this. Here's the thing. I actually recorded that entire process. So you can click down below or click up in the corner to see that full process from start to finish. I was worried the legs would not blend in, but thankfully I was able to make that work since they were salvaged. And look at that beautiful, beautiful wood come to life. I think this project is the one that really made me appreciate not just wood, but red oak, because it's so beautiful and you can do that liming wax in order to get that cerused oak look. All right, so let's look at what my vanity looked like before. Remember, we moved in 2010. I painted it. I tried to make do with what I had. I came up with a crude drawing for what I wanted the vanity to look like, and then I was able to create this. Now, there's some things that I would do differently. Again, this was my very first project that I'd ever built of any kind of significance. And I was so worried that it would collapse. But thankfully, it's been, I think, 7 or 8 years, and it has not collapsed. And so I'm just so thrilled to be able to share with you this process and how difficult it was turning this bathroom into something that I can be proud of. And here's what I would tell you. Don't feel that you have to be perfect in order to tackle a project like this. You're going to make mistakes. It's not going to turn out perfect. However, everything that you learn from that project, you can then apply to your next project. So I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to come back because I am showing you the final reveal for bathroom week for my friend's bathroom. This is what it looked like before, and I tell you, it does not look like that now. And she was a complete DIY newbie, so you're going to enjoy seeing us do this project together. I will see you next video.